April 20th, 1999, the students at Columbine High School had already reached their destination. Many were in the library, many were in their classrooms. And it was about 10 minutes after 11, so some were already in the cafeteria. Two boys entered the building with backpacks, shotguns, rifles. They headed straight to the cafeteria where they left the backpacks full of explosives. They next went to the library where a lot of the students were in there studying and reading and so forth. And one by one, they just went up to them and shot them. One girl in particular named Cassie Bernal was sitting and reading, and one of the young men named Harris went up to her and he put a shotgun to the side of her head. And he said, "Do you believe in God?" And when she said yes, he pulled that trigger and she went straight to the arms of Jesus. Before it was over, there had been 12 students and one teacher killed, 24 injured, many trying to get out of the building. At 12:08, as the police had cornered the boys, they both committed suicide. Cassie was not ashamed to be identified as a Christian. She was not ashamed to be called a child of God. She was not ashamed to be identified with God's Word. She was not ashamed to identify herself with the gospel. Today, folks, there's a lot of ways that we as Christians, we act like we're ashamed that we are even Christians. The world has almost convinced us at Christmas just to say happy holidays, and we've all gotten caught up with that. And at Easter that we just celebrated and still are, you know what that's come to be known? Spring break. Spring break. Paul says that you really can't do much with anything that you're ashamed of. In Romans chapter 1, verse 16, Paul says, "For I am not ashamed of the gospel, for it is the power of God for salvation to everyone who believes." He says, "I'm not ashamed of the gospel, for it is the power of God unto salvation for everyone who believes." You know, you just can't be affected with anything that you're ashamed of. How many of you remember the first time that you went out on a date? Didn't you date a boy or a girl that you would go out with in the daytime? I promised myself that's what I'd do. I was going to date a girl that I'd at least go out with in the daytime. You can't be affected with anything you're ashamed of, and some people apologize about being a Christian and about the gospel that they share. I want to give you an example of that, an example in my life that I believe has been the ultimate example for me about what you can do and can't do when you're ashamed of something. When I was 13 years old, my grandfather died, and he left me his car. And I believe we're going to see that car, okay? Now, those aren't my two girlfriends, okay? I'll tell you who they are as we go along. Now, Black Demon somebody says, you know, is that the name of your car? Well, it was. But I did not name it that. You know who named my car Black Demon? My church. I know you're laughing, but they did. I'm going to tell you what. Now you say, yeah, I know them Baptists. They are weird, you know. We had Vacation Bible School one summer, and the theme was that we're to put on the whole armor of God that we can stand against the wiles of the devil or the schemes of the devil. And so the preacher had the idea that we would dress the kids up, you know, with shields and armor and swords and all that. And they took my car and they put all kind of devil things on it. Pitchforks and, you know, red ears, the typical, you know, devil picture. And we went through neighborhoods out east in Bradenton here. We went through neighborhoods with the kids following the car, you know, with the swords and all, like they were fighting off the devil. And that car became known as Black Demon. And you're not going to believe this, but 1 month ago, I went to a funeral in town here in Bradenton of an old friend, and somebody came up to me and said, "Do you still have Demon?" So Demon lives on. Actually, I started driving that car when I was 12. I told you I was the biggest sinner in here, didn't I? And when I was 15, you could get your, what's it called, permit back then. And that's when you went down and you took an exam at the state trooper office. You know, you didn't go to some storefront. You went down and you had to face the state troopers. And I went in there, and on the application it said, "How long you been driving?" And I put 3 years. I mean, my mom taught me to be honest, and I put down her 3. Yeah, I've been driving since I was 12. That car. And when I got through with the test, the state trooper came over and he looked at me and he said, "How long you been driving?" And I said, 3 years. He just shook his head and walked off. On Friday nights, my dad would drive myself, my sister on the left, her girlfriend on the right, Cheryl and Diane. We would drive to high school football games. And we always went in the Demon. My dad loved to drive Demon. That was his dad's car, you know, been given to me. And I loved riding along, and we sat up front, and the girls would sit in the back. Well, after the game, what do you always do after a football game? You got to go to McDonald's. So we'd head to McDonald's, wherever the game was, Fort Myers, Arcadia, you know, St. Pete, and we'd go to McDonald's. And we'd pull in there, and I'd be so proud of that car, and I'd be sitting up, my dad would be driving, and what did the 2 girls do? They thought their friends were going to see them in that car. And they would hide. Then one Saturday, Diane had spent the night at our house. And Cheryl, my sister, and her friend Diane wanted to go to the beach. And they put on their bathing suits and got their towels and all the goodies and everything. And they come out the door, and guess what only car was at the house? Black Demon. And my sister had the gall to come up to me and ask, could she take Demon to the beach? And folks, I about fell over. I couldn't believe they wouldn't even go to McDonald's and be seen, but they're going to go to the beach. And I gave her the keys, and many of you know you turn the key in those cars and push a button, you know, to start it. And you never seen the sight of those 2 girls at that age right there in Demon going out to the beach. When they got back, My sister came up to me and she said, Hudson, every time we go to the beach, we're taking demon. You know why? It was the spring of the year. The Pittsburgh Pirates had just gotten to town good, and they were all at the beach, and as my sister and her friend drove up and down the beach with that car, every one of those Pittsburgh Pirates boys was chasing after them pretty girls in that cool car. And every time they went to the beach, they took demon. Folks, you can't do and be very effective with anything that you're ashamed of. We shouldn't be ashamed of the gospel. We shouldn't be ashamed of the person of the gospel. The person of the gospel is Jesus Christ. We are what we are today because Jesus made us that way. We should not ever be ashamed to let anyone know that we're a child of the King. Whatever we are because Jesus made it possible in our lives. There's no other person we ought to be more in love with than Jesus Christ. We shouldn't be ashamed of the person of the gospel. We shouldn't be ashamed of his birth. Jesus left the glory and bliss of heaven to be born in a stable, to come down to a level of poverty that could relate to all people. We shouldn't be ashamed of his birth. We shouldn't be ashamed of his life, where he went about doing good wherever he walked. We shouldn't be ashamed of his death because, folks, while we walked around as sinners and still do today, Jesus gave his life for you and me. Even while we were yet sinners, Christ died for us. We should not be ashamed of the person of the gospel. We also shouldn't be ashamed of the power of the gospel, the power of the gospel. For it is the power of God unto salvation. I need to ask you this. How many of you from Kentucky? Don't be afraid to admit that. I'll tell you, I'd be proud to be from Kentucky. A lot of people think I am. I spent a lot of time there. But my home is here in Bradenton. But I spent a lot of time in Kentucky. I went to 4 years of college and 3 years of seminary. Seminary was spent in Louisville. And I'm going to tell you, if I could give all that up and just live 10 years in Kentucky, I probably could have got a better education just being around the people there than I did through all that schooling. Amen. That's right. Thank you. Somebody said that. You must have been from Kentucky, huh? I met a man there, a black Baptist preacher named Lincoln Bingham. Lincoln Bingham. The last time I heard about Lincoln, he was going around Kentucky still starting churches, even in his older age. Lincoln talked about what it was like to grow up in Kentucky in the 40s and 50s and to be a young black man. And he said, you have no idea what powerlessness is, powerlessness, until you grow up like that. And he explained powerlessness. And he said powerlessness is knowing what you want to do, but every time you try to do it, you just can't quite pull it off. Powerlessness, knowing what you want to do, but every time you try to do it, you just can't quite pull it off. Lincoln, he explains about being a young man in Kentucky. He said, I was born in ethnicity, raised in poverty, and lived in obscurity. And somebody said, Lincoln, what do you mean, born in ethnicity, raised in poverty, lived in obscurity? He said, well, I was born in oppression, raised in depression, and lived in suppression. And somebody said, Lincoln, Just speak plain to us. What's going on? He said, okay, I was born black, I was born poor, and I was born in Cerulean, Kentucky. And he said he felt like he was nobody from nowhere with nothing. And every November, his dad would bring home the Sears Roebuck catalog. And he said all the kids got to pick out a present for Christmas. And he said every year, every one of us got the same thing, a pair of shoes. But he said we were so proud of those shoes. He said we'd put those shoes on, and he said we'd just get up praising God. He said we'd start singing, I got shoes, you got shoes, all God's children got shoes. And he said we just had a good time with that because he said we knew the love of God. And you know what? Being nobody from nowhere with nothing and receiving the power that comes when you receive Jesus as Savior is what really makes the difference. People today need some kind of power to make a difference in their lives. The poor, the sick, the lost, the lame, the hungry, they're all locked out. And they need Jesus to come into their life and pick them up and say, you are somebody, and make that difference in their life. Lincoln went off to school, and they had a spelling test one day. And one of the words was poor, P-O-O-R. And, you know, he took the test and turned it in. And the teacher got Lincoln's paper, and she was looking at it, and she said, Lincoln, you don't spell poor, P-O. He said, yes, you do if you were there. And he said, it ain't what the statisticians had determined was the poverty level. He said, we was po. He said, it was pronounced po and spelled P-O because we couldn't even afford the other two letters. People poor spiritually need Jesus to come into their life to make the difference. Jesus will remove the stigma of your spiritual poverty and the pains of your spiritual poverty. Don't be ashamed of the gospel. Don't be ashamed of the power of God that leads to salvation. Don't be ashamed of the power of the gospel. And then last of all, don't be ashamed of the product of the gospel. You know what the product of the gospel is? Raise your hand because it's you. It's me. We're the product of the gospel. Jeremiah went down to the potter's house. You remember that story in the Old Testament? And he went down to the potter's house and he went to watch the master at work. And he watched as the potter took the piece of clay and molded and shaped it into a beautiful vessel. And what that taught Jeremiah is that when we become a child of God, He is the potter and we are the clay. And with every piece of clay that He has ever taken, God has molded and shaped it into a vessel of honor that He can use to His glory. You are the product of the gospel. We should not be ashamed of the product of the gospel. I met a lot of folk in Kentucky, and I'll tell you, I've got great memories of them, and I think you'll probably never hear me preach that I don't tell a Kentucky story. I met a man there named James. James was from deep East Kentucky. And he had moved to our area. And he spoke broken English, and I loved just to hear him talk. And James became a Christian, he and his wife and the two girls and his mom and dad and her mom and dad. And I tell you, I never cried so hard in church in the day that I saw every one of them be baptized together. But James came to me one day and he said, Hudson, he said, what I got, God can use. What I got, God can use. And it took God a little while, but God took that piece of clay called James, and he molded and shaped James into that vessel of honor that he could use to his glory. You see, being nobody from nowhere with nothing, and God picking you up and saying you are somebody and proving it to the world will put a song in your heart. You are the product of the gospel. If Jesus is real in your life, you won't be ashamed of what he's done in your life. He brought you from where you were and has taken to where you are today. And if you'll walk with him, if you'll serve him, if you'll love him, he'll open doors that nobody can close, and he'll close doors that nobody can open. Don't be ashamed of what he can do with you. Don't be ashamed of the product of the gospel. A little while after the Columbine High School tragedy, Michael W. Smith, many of you know him, is the singer-songwriter, the Christian singer-songwriter. In fact, one of the first, like he and Amy Grant and some of the others. I don't know all of them. Todd could tell you, the music man. But I know Michael W. Smith, and Michael W. Smith went and visited President Clinton at the White House. And they were talking about all kind of stuff, and President Clinton brought up about Columbine High School, and he told Michael W. Smith, he said, you know what you could do? He said, one of the neatest, greatest things you could do would be to write a song about that tragedy. And Michael W. Smith went back home, and he wrote a song and made a video. And he gave it in honor of Cassie Bernal. She was not ashamed to admit that she loved God, and he was her father, and she paid the ultimate price for admitting it. You're going to get to see Cassie in just a moment. You're going to watch the video and hear the song. She's at the very beginning. I don't know if you can understand what she says, but she's at the very start of the video. It's called This Is Your Time. Folks, this is our time to stand up, our time to be unashamed, to be the approved workman of God, rightly dividing the word of truth, to stand up as Christians and say, I am the product of the gospel. Watch this, would you, and see Cassie, and then hear the song.
I think that the way I'm advancing the kingdom is just being a loyal friend and a good example to non-believers and also Christians. Just trying to not contradict myself and get rid of all hypocrisy and just to live for Christ.
It was a test we could all hope to pass, but none of us would want to take. Faced with the choice to deny God and live, for her there was one choice to make. This was a time, this was a dance. She lived every moment, left nothing to chance. She swam in the sea, drank of the deep, embraced the mystery of all she could be. And this was her time. Though you are mourning and grieving your loss, death died a long time ago. Swallowed in life, so her life carries on. Still it's so hard to let go. This was a time, this was a dance. She lived every moment, left nothing to chance.